Welcome all. Thank you for taking the time to log in today. I'm Phil Wagner, founder and CEO of Sparta Science. We're super excited. Have over about 1,600 now registered for this webinar, and I think it speaks to the unique circumstances that we're in. You know, for the first time, we're all bound by the same circumstances, you know, at the same time. And I think in particular, when we talk about sports, being unpredictable by nature, but we've never had a situation where every athlete at every level in every sport has had their plans completely uncertain. And so I think while the current situation is still pretty grim for a lot of us, or for the country, it's given us the opportunity to learn from our peers and collaborate at some pretty unprecedented rates. And so as we discuss our topic today of the re-entry into sport, we have some unbelievable panelists ready to share their perspectives, their experiences. And so I'll provide a brief intro of the entire panel first, and then we'll have each of you touch on your background and why you're passionate about this topic, about re-entry into sport. And so I'll go through this briefly. You know, Dr. Karen Sutton is an orthopedic surgeon at HSS. Karen's also the team physician of US Lacrosse and the chief medical officer for World Lacrosse, as well as a team physician for US Ski and Snowboard. Mark Stephenson is the director of player performance with the Detroit Lions and was formerly the director of human performance at Naval Special Warfare Development Group down in Virginia Beach. Dr. Kate Webster is professor and researcher at Trobe University in Australia, and her focus is on exercise and rehabilitation, and specifically expertise in ACL, alongside her colleague who's joining us, Tim Hewett. He's a researcher in the area of biophysics, biomechanics, and sports medicine. And Tim has over 50,000 citations of his work in the medical literature. And so, Dr. Sutton, if we start with you, could you briefly touch on your background a bit deeper and why you're passionate about this topic?
Sure. So my background, I'm a sports medicine surgeon at Hospital for Special Surgery, as you mentioned. It's affected us greatly during my role as Chief Medical Officer for World Lacrosse, where we ended up having to postpone our World Championships games, which were supposed to take place in Ireland in July. So I was working with our COVID task force with World Lacrosse and just delved deep into COVID, how contagious it is. And then we just had to make some pretty significant decisions for the safety of our athletes, our coaches, as well as our spectators. You don't realize how much it really affects people. And then just working from our youth sports to elite athletes to weekend warriors, it's affecting all of us, from our training protocols to our cross training, even our mindset and leadership skills.
Great, and Mark Stephenson, same question. You touched briefly on the background and passion behind this topic.
Sure, yeah. So my background is, started in sports medicine. I'm an athletic trainer by trade, transitioning, in the human performance world, strength and conditioning and sports psychology and so forth. But I've been working specifically in recovery and sustainment of high performance for the past 15, 16 years. So when we get in a situation like this, it's very passionate about, because, the whole goal and the whole mission is, how do we sustain performance for these individuals, these athletes, whether you're a recreational, professional, high school, or college, it doesn't matter. Performing at a high level is something that, you want to do, or could be your profession. So finding ways to sustain that is crucial. When you get into a situation like this, as we'll talk about later, our risk of injury goes up exponentially. So.
Right. And Dr. Webster?
Hi, so I'm joining you all the way from Melbourne, Australia today. I'm a research professor at La Trobe University. My background is a science background, and I have a PhD specialising in both physiology and psychology. My main area of research interest, as you mentioned, is ACL injury and reconstruction surgery. And I'm particularly interested, all facets of that, but mainly in the psychological aspect of injury and then re-entry into sport. So this situation really presents a very unique situation for us. And I'm interested in just the stress and anxiety a lot of our athletes are under and what advice we can give in relation to that. I collaborate with one of the largest specialist orthopaedic knee clinics in Melbourne, where we would see something around 750 to 800 ACL reconstructions per year. So we're really managing at the moment with people, a large group of athletes who have just had treatment and a lot of online facilities for those, as well as those athletes who are wanting to have surgery, but all elective surgery in Australia now obviously is shut as well. So how we're going to manage that too.
Great. And Dr. Hewett?
Hi, I'm Tim Hewett. I am a scientist. I hold PhDs in biophysics and physiology, and I've held leadership positions, run labs and institutes at the Mayo Clinic, the Ohio State University, and Cincinnati Children's Hospital as well. And the reason I'm really passionate about this area is return to sport. For example, at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, I had 6 people in my lab at one time who had 2 ACL injuries. And that makes people, that's second time, especially when you return to sport early, is when it usually happens and you have your next injury. That second injury is devastating. It makes people want to study for the rest of their lives and figure out how to not let this happen to them again or to anyone else. And over the past several years, Kate actually did a sabbatical in my lab about 5 years ago, and we started collaborating, trying to figure out, can you really predict who's going to do well returning to sport, and how do the current protocols match up? And basically what we started to find is what people are currently doing, what's out there published in the literature, has very little reliability. And when you look at down the line, it also has very little validity. So very passionate about getting people back to their sport safely.
That's great. Yeah, it's certainly why I got into this personally. I think, so we're going to spend the next 30 minutes discussing kind of the topics related to this return to sport, and then it'll open up for question and answer for the remainder of the hour. You can use the Q&A feature to submit your questions for the panelists or myself as we go through. But, it's certainly unprecedented to have this entire population out of formalized training at the same time. And the challenge of managing both detraining and what's going to be happening here is a condensed off season. But all this isn't actually necessarily new because, athletes at all sports, when they return from their time away, their physical and mental state have been relatively untracked. And the expectations are pretty high to get in shape, both physically and mentally, pretty quickly. And so a great example, probably the most extreme scenario in sports, is the NFL, because there's actually 2 off seasons every year. One's right after the season, before off-season workouts. And the second off season for the NFL is actually the 6 weeks in between leading up to the start of training camp. And so, to no one's surprise, those are the 2 biggest spikes of injuries that occur, is those 2 periods for the NFL. And so to kind of kick this off here, I want to start with Mark and ask, Mark, what are some of the steps taken in the NFL to identify the condition of the individual, and then also how to manage those kinds of risks during these more susceptible times?
Well, sure. Traditionally, with those 2 off seasons, just a lot of communication. We make some assumptions for the start of off-season program training that they haven't done much, if anything, because we don't want them to. We need them to recover from from their injuries, their wear and tear, and the chronic stuff they had throughout the season. Just really want to decompress. So as they start coming back, we slowly ramp that up throughout the several 8 to 9 weeks that we have, and we have little spikes in there with OTAs and minicamp and so forth. So we plan for that, and then we have that drop off again before the training camp starts. But a lot of these guys have their own facilities that they train at, private facilities. So a lot of those guys will take care of that. We don't have much interaction. We're not able to, per the CBA, have too much interaction with that. When we're in a situation like this, it's a little bit harder. So right now, like our strength conditioning staff, our head strength coach is already, geared up, drop shipped some equipment to some people that need it, that are stuck at their homes. But, it's unprecedented. So we're all colleagues throughout the league are, in a big challenge right now.
Right. And Tim, I know that you had posted recently a tweet around those times of injuries, particularly with the NFL and Achilles injuries. So
Yes.
didn't know if you or others had comments on that.
Yes, several of my colleagues, Rob Height, Greg Meyer, many others at Ohio State. We've been tracking, especially the NFL, but also the NBA for many years, since the mid '90s. When I was at Cincinnati Children's, the docs, many of the surgeons we work with covered the Bengals, and Rob Height had great connections throughout the league. So we have data that goes way 25 years back. And basically what we showed was after the NFL lockout, the number of Achilles tendon injuries coming back because they had that shortened preseason and ramped up really fast, and the guys had been 5 or 6 months away from their medical teams, people like Mark. The number of Achilles tendon injuries almost quadrupled. It was huge. It was enormous. And I was at Ohio State at the time that we published that, and a lot of press came out of it. And actually I had a reporter call me, and we were talking about the study, and he asked me, there's rumors, it looks like they're going to have a lockout of the NBA. And, what do you think? Could the same thing happen? And I said, well, I hate to speculate and extrapolate, but here I go. I'm not shy. So I went ahead and said, I predict there's going to be a rash of injuries, maybe ACL injuries. And that year, the number of ACL injuries it was between doubled and tripled normal level of ACL injuries. So somewhat anecdotally, we have some solid data here and there, but somewhat anecdotally, yeah, you ramp up, you take a lot of time off, and you ramp back up quickly, you better watch out. You better expect a rash of ligament tendon type injuries. It happens.
Yeah, and I think with this time alone, want to kind of involve Karen here as well. If any of you guys follow her on social media, like she's always posting workouts and some of the habits, to make time and build opportunities at home. So, just wanted to kind of share your thoughts on some of the more impactful things or habits athletes can be doing to make the most of the time at home.
Well, I started something called the Stay at Home Challenge, which a lot of people are buying into, but I think it's really important to make this a positive experience for people. I know this is daunting. The disease is very concerning, but one thing, the way I live my life, and I try to surround my patients, my athletes, with at least positive thinking and control what you can control. So I would start with being a good athlete and trying to get back to what you enjoy, seeing the positivity that's happening. And as this is going on, a lot of people are starting to do skills, challenging their friends to do skills. I do think this is reiterated where getting together via some sort of video conferencing and seeing your teammates, being involved. It takes both a mental aspect to this, confidence. You still want to have your leadership traits come through. But then as you're training, one thing when we're working with our performance coaches, such as Mark, they really direct the show and give us this multimodal sense of working out, where we're engaging our core, we're engaging our glutes. And this is going to be a time to step back and see, okay, sure, I love the cardio, I love running all day, but are you starting to teeter off in terms of your glutes and your core strengthening? So a self-awareness is going to be really important during this time.
Yeah, self-awareness, and a lot of what you keyed in there is the psychology of the athlete. And I know that's a big interest of Kate's and a lot of the research that she's done. I think also kind of, some of the research she's looked at in relation to that is also fatigue, and how some fatigue actually doesn't necessarily increase, at least when it comes to lower limbs, that injury risk. And Tim and Kate actually published a meta-analysis entitled "Fatigue Does Not Increase Lower Limb Injury Risk." And so along those lines, didn't know, that's a pretty impactful finding, right? That fatigue didn't have influence on the likelihood of sustaining an injury. And so, that'll be a factor here too, as athletes start to come back and return to sport. So just wanted to kind of, if you could elaborate more on this concept of fatigue and injury as athletes are re-engaging back in sport.
Tim, I'll let you take the fatigue and I'll tackle the psychological aspect.
How many hours do we have, Phil? So, it's an intuitive thing, and it's common knowledge that fatigue causes injuries. Fatigue causes ACL injuries, fatigue causes everything. People, it's a belief, and it's a strongly held belief. And we tested that. We started testing that over a decade ago to figure out, does fatigue really do that? If you look, we've got pretty good data specifically on ACLs. So we published papers on ACLs, hamstrings, other muscle injuries, tendon injuries, and when you do a meta-analysis across the entire literature, you don't see such an effect. Say if you look at the time in the quarter in the match, say at the beginning of the match or game versus right before the second half or at the end of the game, there's no difference. And when you do a meta-analysis and you look at all the effects on biomechanics, now again, you're going to have to cut me off here, because basically when people say, well, it causes more valgus, which is a diagnostic for injury, it really doesn't. In some studies it does, some studies it stays exactly the same, some studies valgus decreases. The only thing consistently in biomechanics is the force goes down. Well, you need force to tear ACLs. And we just published a paper, it just came out in IJSPT with one of our fellows from China, and he showed clearly for second ACL injuries, this is in televised professional sports, no such effect on injury risk. So we're not saying, don't prepare your athletes to be fatigued, but fatigue doesn't cause injuries. That's relatively clear. The one thing that falls out though is early in preseason is when injuries spike. So again, getting back to this point of guys being off. Now, some people say, well, that's because they're fatigued. Not necessarily. It's from going from very little load to very high load very rapidly. And that's different than fatigue.
So it's a tissue issue more than a fatigue.
Yeah, when you think about it, fatigue, when you get fatigued, you slow down. Force is mass times velocity squared. That means your force is lower and your risk actually decreases with fatigue.
So if you want me to now tackle some of the psychological aspects we've been discussing, certainly the measures that are being put in place to stop COVID have significantly impacted on our lives and our sport. And as Karen mentioned, in terms of the physical aspect, I was nodding my head away because those very same suggestions also do have a psychological and mental health and wellbeing. And I've been very encouraged to see a number of psychological societies and sporting codes put some really useful information out there for athletes to potentially limit the psychological impact and also maximise some of the opportunities in front of them. So briefly, some of these are that it's okay with being stressed. We're all having stress and anxiety, and to recognise that some level of stress and anxiety is actually very normal and okay. And it's what we do next and what actions we take that probably matter most. So as Karen said, preparing for training, staying socially connected to our teammates, using whatever mechanisms we can online. Things like this are going to be really important. as well as focusing on things that are within our control, such as eating healthily, and as Mark said, having, equipment ready for us for home training. So being very proactive in that area, setting short-term goals for athletes, staying healthy and using routines. So continuing to exercise and having a good sleep routine is really important, I think, as well, as is maintaining structure. Athletes are really used to having schedules and being on schedules and thrive on that. So it's really important to keep those schedules up and actually scheduling time to exercise. Staying connected to support networks and checking in on your others as well, and your other fellow athletes is going to be really important during this time too.
Yeah, so my take out of that is obviously the connectedness socially, right? The self-awareness, and Karen used that term as well. And then a lot of the routines, trying to keep those routines going, and in some cases utilizing this opportunity to build better routines if that opportunity allows. Just kind of want to open one question up to the group too. A lot of sports science is kind of based on load, training load, how much load's placed on the individual, and then the reason why, right, is fatigue monitoring. So if we've got load and fatigue monitoring, how do those two kind of fit together if fatigue may not be, a major risk factor for injury?
So Phil, I think with that, and maybe Tim can clarify or define fatigue, because it's sort of like the sleep issue, sleep deprivation, all these studies. These are acute or short-term things that we're looking at. When we look at the chronic aspect, so just like fatigue, load gets a bad rap too. Is like, well, these high chronic loads leads to injury. Well, actually, they don't. So part of the problem is in those pre-seasons or those beginning of the season, the high, especially soft tissue injury rates are really because there wasn't a high chronic load prior to. So now you get the spike when it comes to competing. So in pre-season, you're competing for a spot. In season, you're competing on the schedule. But the training leading up to that, if you're keeping your loads low, keeping your fatigue low, then you're getting this huge deflection or this huge spike that causes, the body can't handle that. But if we progressively increase those chronic loads, fatigue itself, the muscle fatigue, or in that, human beings as a species are extremely resilient. So we overlook that. So a 3-hour competition for our species is nothing. Okay. So that the body's built for that. But if over time and you don't take care of yourself, you don't train properly, you don't load or keep that load up there, then the injury risk becomes higher, especially when you get those big spikes.
Again, you need books to get into this, but just on the fatigue end of it, there's many, many different types of fatigue. There's mental fatigue, and that you can break that down into cortical or peripheral. Then there's muscle fatigue, there's tissue fatigue, there's aerobic versus anaerobic. There's a lot of issues on the line here. That's why just making blanket statements about what fatigue does is really problematic. The other thing that's problematic is making statements about what load does, because again, you read the recent work of Franco Impellizzeri, which is excellent work. He basically points out that this acute to chronic workload ratio thing is a bit of a myth. It's been put out there as this is science. No, it's a coaching paradigm. And again, it makes sense. It seems to make common sense. Again, looking at, especially as we talk about, from going relatively low load to jumping into high load. But the ratio itself is probably not the best way to go, and it's probably not very predictive as it's been touted. So again, I think the main points are common sense is not necessarily all that common, nor does it necessarily make that much sense. I think we need to go back to the science. I think we need to go back to solid longitudinal data and really figure out what does predict or at least stratify risk for athletes out there.
Yeah, with that in mind, what sort of efforts should be placed to help mitigate the risk when we're coming back here? If fatigue and load are such conceptual gray areas, for those on the call that are more tactical focused, what are some areas they should be focusing on or can be focusing to help mitigate that risk?
I'd say get psyched up, follow Karen, and stay in shape. I'm in the best shape of my life just from following Karen on Me. I tell you, she's got me revved up, and I'll tell you, that's the main thing, is don't drop off. Yes, take breaks. I understand you go on vacation, take a week or two break, but don't drop really low on load. That's problematic. That's where things, start to break down, and then you make huge jumps back into it. And that again, I think, is what we can say about all this. And regarding fatigue, get in better shape so that you don't get fatigued out on the court and out on the field. That's just going to enhance your performance and again, help you play at a high rate. I don't think we need to use that as an injury predictor, because I don't think it really is one.
The other thing I would say, Phil, is looking at kind of how the football seasons run into their preseason training, where starting without pads and going towards more contact. So one of the problems we see, and then Tim can comment on this as well, is as our athletes are returning, for example, from an ACL reconstruction, there's the time that they finish physical therapy and then the time that we want to get them back on the field. And to get them on the field, we have to recreate some of the simulations that they'll experience. So right now, a lot of athletes are not experiencing contact. They're not putting their equipment on. They're not in the elements. They're not in that competitive nature. The adrenaline isn't pumping as much. So if you don't want to run in the rain, run in the rain. If you feel like it's too hot outside, test yourself and run outside. So you're going to have to put yourself into these challenging positions that maybe your coach isn't telling you to do, but I think we need to work it where we gradually err into, putting the equipment on, getting the contact. And it's that neuromuscular response that the body's going to have when, if you're playing a sport that's requiring a lot of pivoting or cutting, or there's aggressive defense, that's what we're going to have to work back up to. And we see a lot of injuries when athletes are not prepared for that.
And I couldn't agree with you more, Karen. I think you have to, if you're going to prepare to not be injured, and most injuries happen in games, when you're playing at your highest level, when you're pushing your body to the limit, you need to prepare at that level. And you can't take 9 months off from doing that sort of activity and then expect to jump right back into that activity. Prepare it. There are many ways, and you show them to us. I love all your techniques of training because you put yourself out there. I love to practice what you preach ethic. Get out there and simulate some game type situations throughout the year.
Great. I know we've had, as we've been talking, quite a few questions coming in around some of these topics, particularly some of the ones that are more controversial. Fatigue, what is it? As practitioners, how can we screen individuals? And so at this point, kind of hand it over to my colleague, Brian. And Brian, I don't know if there are certain questions that you want to start off with here.
Yeah, great. I'll throw some out there and we can get going with this. And, we'll start right away here with, one directed at Kate. In the treatment of athletes who are returning to sport, where do you see the role of visualization and mental imagery in this process?
Oh, both are incredibly important. The research is a bit equivocal, but I think without a doubt, it shows that those factors are very important in preparing somebody psychologically for a return to sport, particularly after injury. And at this point in time, that's one of the best methods we have, because we can't, as Karen mentioned, we can't get out and do, one-on-one combat with our fellow athletes and things like that. So both of those things are very much, should be at the forefront at the moment. And there's some pretty novel things people are doing in that area too.
Great. And anyone, when we're going through this, feel free to hop in on these as well. But here's another question coming in, and this one's more directed towards Mark. Considering the extreme importance of private sports performance facilities during players' off seasons and their goal of preparing athletes for their teams, the majority of which are now closed, what's a realistic expectation of players' physical performance readiness entering the adjusted OTAs and camp this year?
Well, the expectation is going to be pretty low. There are certain things that, as both Tim and Karen alluded to on you're not getting the exposures that you need to prepare. So keeping some level of conditioning is important so we can make that transition. But we have to fully expect these guys are not going to be ready to go like they normally are. So we're even further behind the eight ball. With the professional athletes, especially in NFL, part of the problem they have is, they may have a place they can train at their house or whatever, but not all of them do. Not all of them are situated that way. But they also have families, and the families don't see them much during the season at all. And now I'm sure these, the little kids are around and they want to be with them and they want to be with dad. So that takes a lot of time, and that mental energy starts getting expended as well. So our expectations are pretty low right now, and we're still working on how we're going to address it once we have a timeline of them coming back online.
I think one of the interesting things that you touched upon, Mark, is that people don't really talk about is now we're multitasking. So we're working from home, our children are at home, we're working out from home. I think one opportunity, and this certainly couldn't be for their high-powered workouts, but trying to engage your children. So, I'll have a ladder drill that I'll be doing, and then have 2 little ladder drills with the children next door that at least you're trying to get some workout in and then engaging them at the same time. And maybe you're doing burpees and they're doing a hula hoop, but I've designed circuits for the children when I'm doing a circuit. And so it may not be my usual workout, but at least they're engaging and, trying to do that multitasking approach. It's challenging, but at least it's something.
Absolutely.
Yeah, good point. And I think, we get in a lot of this one right now, but I think, a good question, and really this goes for all you here, feel free to answer, how can we best screen our athletes as practitioners? What should be our priorities to measure upon when athletes return? What's going to be the first thing we want to do?
Personally, I like the vertical jump. I think vertical jump is a really nice, along with drop jumps, are really good diagnostics. They give you that valgus collapse kinematic. You can look at the acceleration points at takeoff. You can look at peak forces, peak takeoff forces, peak landing forces. You can look at the ratio of the two, and you can get at what is the overall level of the integral under the curve. So if you look at any force plate data, whether you're jumping off of it and back onto it or walking across it, what you have is this M-shaped curve, right? It's a 2-humped camel. And what I look at is the first part of the hump, that the takeoff is you pushing off on the force plate, right? And that is your ability to generate power. And then so that I call that the power curve or the safety variable. And then on the second part, that second hump, you look at landing, and that's when the force plate is hitting you back. And that's what I call your risk variable. So when you start getting into those ratios of how much power you generate before relative to how hard you allow the ground to hit you back and how well you dissipate those forces, that's some great data. And that's been our go-to for 25 years. And I think it has, you know, it's controversial. It has pretty good predictive value. It's not perfect. It has relatively good sensitivity and specificity, but we need to do things. We need to always improve.
Great. Okay. Well, I'll fire off another one here. I'm just going to keep them going for you guys. This has been good. And this one more is directed towards how we can communicate with coaches coming back. And the question is, you know, what's the best advice to educate sport coaches with the management of progressing back into practices based on total load? I think as a coach, they're going to try and, you know, get in there and get their 2 cents in. But what's the best way to educate sport coaches in this?
I'll go here. So I think part of the thing is just obviously educating coaches is not always easy, sport coaches, because they want, like you said, they're going to want to cram in a lot in a short period of time. Right now, whatever level you're at, but if you're going into season or your season might start up abruptly again, everybody feels behind the 8 ball. What we have to do is get them off of that perspective and really focus on, I always go to risk management. You know, hey, we're going to have a lot of hamstring, a lot of Achilles injuries if we don't do it the right way, if we're not smart and strategize on how we do it. And, you know, I can't say across the board, hey, here's the roadmap to do it. Your team culture is part of it. Your coach's culture is part of it, organizational. So you have to work together with the players and the coaches and your staff to come up with a reasonable plan to do it. Unfortunately, there's no cookie cutter way to do it.
I think one thing that I'd love for Kate to comment on too is, you know, looking at it from, so I'm at HSS right now and we're in Manhattan, which is the center of this epidemic. And it's a challenging time, but I think communication has been extremely amazing during this time, from our leadership to communicating with other hospitals. And so I think going into the athletic side, I think communication constantly from the coaches and from a video standpoint. So not texting, not emails, but you have to hear that verbal communication. And I'd love for Kate to comment on the verbal communication and video communication versus just written communication. And I think that's really helpful. And then I'd love for Kate to talk about just setting goals for an athlete. She touched upon this, but I think the goals and expectations that are coming from coaches to the players and really trying to define those goals and expectations, because the more a player and an athlete feels organized from above, I think they'll do better coming into this. So I'd love for Kate to comment on those 2 things.
Yeah, absolutely. You threw a few things at me, Karen, so remind me if I don't touch on all of them. Yeah, communication is key. That's the phrase we're always saying, and in this situation, it really couldn't be more apt. We're missing, as human beings, we need physical communication with people, and I'm sure everyone on the panel and everyone listening as well is really missing those chats in the corridor that you have with people in your workplace, at school and things like that. So actually missing seeing people face to face. So this is why things like Zoom and online platforms are really important at this time, and having that network around you, where I know, like my group, we have, you know, a Friday afternoon get together still where we chat, and all those means can't be more important. And it's really, emails to touch base is still really good as well, but having these other facilities is what's really, I think, keeping people sane in this really unpredictable time. So strategies for that by the coaches are really important. I'm seeing my children play Australian rules football, so we're in the situation where we were just about to start our season, and then it was obviously stopped. So the kids did some of their pre-training, they were about to play, and then indefinitely they don't know when they're going back. So we're seeing some really good WhatsApp, Facebook chat groups where the coach is giving the kids weekly run of, here, do these challenges. Some are physical, some are psychological, like have a walk around as much as social distancing can, walk around your neighbourhood and things like that. So all of that's really important. One of the things that I've seen our coaches do that I think is really neat is they're asking the athletes, particularly the younger athletes, to practice being grateful. We're all going to experience a whole range of emotions during this time, and gratitude can really, I think, help keep things in perspective. So they're asking the kids to list each day something that you learnt today or something that you can be proud of. And I think those sorts of things are really going to be protective for our younger athletes and put things in perspective. And then that will help them set reasonable goals as well. Have I answered all the questions there, or did I miss? Yeah, another sort of more psychological aspect too is that we're really being bombarded information and unsure about things. So we call it, quieten your mind. So it's probably a good time to practice or take up some practices of both mindfulness and even meditation. And there's a few really good apps out there for that, that are free, such as Headspace, and that can really help you let some of the stresses and anxiety go, which is, again, really important for our young athletes at this point in time.
I would agree too. I think exercise is the best pill. I think that's clear. Psychologically, exercise has as good a benefit as any drug out there. And what I call it is cooling my brain, and best way to cool the brain is to go exercise. If you don't feel like taking a run, bike. If you don't feel like biking, walk, and just keep up your resistance workouts, keeps your mind sharp, and that's a key to a lot of this, whether it's inside or outside, is keeping your exercise level high. I absolutely agree with Kate and Karen on that.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think we'll go back to Mark on this one to start us off, and everyone else feel free to chime in on this one. Many intake protocols and screens are very comprehensive nowadays. With this limited time we have, we can't practically do it all. So what are some things we can strip away? Is there anything you see commonly done that may not be worth the time at this point?
Unfortunately, that's going to be, case by case. What's most important to you and your organization, your culture, that you feel that you could strip away? I mean, at the end of the day, from my time, both in sports and the military, I mean, we were at a point where because it was our task, but we did so many assessments. And it really boiled down, when we went through, 8 years of data and looked at everything and really cleaned it all up, it only boiled down to a couple of things. And, I think Tim mentioned it earlier, using force plates is a very quick and easy way to assess a lot of things. And, you can eliminate probably about 7-8 different other tests that you're doing just by watching or evaluating how someone jumps. From that standpoint. The other thing is, and Kate mentioned it, exercise is important, but that mindfulness or that meditation, and, meditation is a skill to a point, but there's also an inherent way. I mean, if you're just focusing on one thing, and prayer is a great, example of meditation. So if you're spiritual, just praying alone, whatever that is, will help. If you're not, or you could just focus on, one specific thing, visualization, all those things help. And you don't have to worry on all these other assessments. Bottom line is how they come in, how they move, and that's what you're looking at. And vertical jump is one of the best ways to look at that.
I'll follow up with that with Mark. Completely agree with everything you said. So this actually was one of the first papers that Kate and I published together. For example, when I went out to New York City, I was working with the largest group of physical therapy group in the state. I think it was 80 plus clinics. and they were testing to return athletes back to sport from ACL injury, they had something like 18 different tests. And, this is Rob Panarello, great guy, amazing physical therapist, athletic trainer, Timmy Stump, good friends of mine. And they had me come out there and assess it. And I basically said, you got to read this paper, which we called 5 facts max. In other words, you can optimize at 5 predictive factors at the most. So what's the background of that? The idea is, if you have a good predictive factor for relative downstream injury risk, it has an R value of at least 0.4, which means it accounts an R square value of 20%. So it accounts for at least 20% of the variation of your logistic regression model. Well, if that means if 20%, that means you should only have 5 factors at the most in your predictive model, which means you shouldn't be testing more than 5 tests. More tests than that you're wasting your time. So that's a basic tenet of everything we do in predictive value. Agree with everything Mark said. Don't do too much testing. You're just gonna fatigue people, whatever that is, and you're gonna fatigue your testers, and you're gonna be wasting time. So cut that back to 5 at the max. Most of our regression analyses come out to be 3 to 4 factors that are gonna be really useful in combination.
Now, is that 5 tests or 5 variables?
Well, that's 5 tests, and then you pull out of those 5 tests. 5 tests max, 5 variables max. Okay, so that might only be 3 tests where you come up with 5 variables.
Got it.
No, that's really good, Tim. I want to add on to that. I know everyone's worried about, what type of training and how much, these athletes can handle, but what about the recovery side of it? So how do we foresee changing up the recovery methods once we transition back into sport? Is that going to be done at a lot higher volume, or is it going to stay the same, or where do you see that going at this point?
I think recovery will certainly be a key point to this. The training is going to be different, looking ahead into what's to come after we get to the other side of this. I think the training sessions may be smaller groups, and it may be more intense during that time. So we'll have to start getting used to a little bit more of those individual training sessions. So I think recovery from maybe higher intensity training is going to be important, whether it's compressive devices, ice, manual techniques, I think is going to be really critical, because I think people are going to ramp up. But I think it's also going to be recovery from the mental side of things too, along with the physical.
And also with recovery, I mean, it's more than just resting. There's an active component to it, or an interactive component to it. Again, just that mindset, your brain's perceptions, your body's reality. So when it comes to recovery, doing the modalities are great. And there's some are, really good if you have access to them. But what you always have access to is your brain. So your mindset and mindfulness is one of the most powerful recovery tools to help you sleep, which is another powerful quality of sleep, is another powerful recovery tool.
Right. We just got this one in. It says, many of us are already in a position where our athletes have deconditioned due to extended time off unexpectedly. How do we educate our league decision makers about the need for earlier reintroduction to sport-specific training? How powerful is this room? Let's hear it.
I'm going to opt out. I got
There's a fine on that other end. Yeah, exactly. Good move.
I mean, from the lacrosse perspective, I think a lot of it is going to start with communication. So as we're getting back to sport-specific training, I think first of all, outlining, this is before we get back to it, but I think coaches really need to help to outline, and performance coaches need to outline the day for athletes. So it's really important, one, to have that schedule of the day. So people need to wake up at the appropriate time. They need to plan their nutrition for the day. If it's 6 a.m. that you're working out. Before all of this started, it should be 6 a.m. that you're working out again. I think we're seeing a little bit of this mindset where people are kind of starting their day at 10 a.m., 10:30 a.m. And so one, I would say to get back to your regular schedule and your routine. So we know if you practice at 4 o'clock and you have games at 4 o'clock, you'll perform better during that time. So really organizing your day and organizing your week a bit more. And then as we're getting back to sport-specific training, I think seeing what skills you can conquer at home. So in lacrosse, for example, everybody's either using the bounce back or something where they're passing back and forth, wall ball. So just getting the reps in. And I think it's having that muscle memory that's contagious the whole time. And so, but I do think I would forewarn in terms of sports specific, I do see a lot of these challenges where it's how many wall balls, how many throws can you do, how many dribbles can you do? And I do worry that we're getting away from, you know, just holding a plank for a certain amount of time. So I still would say it's great to be sports specific, but your core and your glutes are going to be the one that are going to power you through a lot of these sports at the start.
And that's where some of the question before about visualization came into play. Muscle memory, there is some evidence that by just visualizing doing your sports movements, muscle memory can come into play too. So think about it as well.
Yeah, we're getting a little bit of feedback actually from something you mentioned earlier, Tim. You know, when you mentioned acute to chronic workload, it sounded like the panel did not see much relevance in it. Can you guys elaborate a little bit on this just a tad further?
Well, here's the thing. So the acute to chronic workload ratio, it got a lot of play. It basically got in front of itself. Now, Tim Gabbett, who really championed that, is a great guy. I love the concept, and I think the idea is a good one. It conceptually, it makes intuitive sense. In practice, I don't know how many of you have seen that sweet spot curve. Franco and Pellizzari, I can't recommend. He's published. He basically called for all those papers to be redacted because basically his point is there's no validity to this. One of his latest papers, they put in random numbers and came up with the same predictive ability as what they claimed from original data. I think as a coaching tool, it's a reasonable idea. It does make intuitive sense. Again, when you go from a chronic low level of load to an acute big spike in load, it makes sense that you're going to increase injury risk. The problem is that curve, and especially the values of that ratio, like where it says, okay, if your 0.4 is your sweet spot, basically there's studies that have come out at the 0.4 ratio is when they had the peak in their injuries. So the predictive value of it is not great. I think the idea of tracking is a good one. However, I would say where the data is currently is we don't know what that data tells us very well as far as what relative injury risk is. I'm just saying it's a reasonable coaching idea, but as a scientific concept, it has weak to very limited validity.
I'll come at it from a different angle. When you look at the acute chronic work ratio based on Tim's work, which I actually love his work from a perspective of looking at things a different way. But when you look at that, the problem with any of these things, it's one set of data. Working with athletes is not one set of data or one data set. It's really looking at, okay, I can look at my acute chronic GPS data or my RPEs, but what's my HRV? What's my feedback from the athlete? How's the athlete feel? And if I can just monitor his internal or his or her internal temp and heart rate variability, I mean, that alone, I don't even need to talk to the athlete. And there's plenty of evidence on that. But how the athlete feels is a big part of how we address anything, because they may look high based on what, but for them, it's not high. But that same load for someone else may be really high, even if they're at the same position and they're at the same level of play. So we are individuals, and we have to look at each other, look at our athletes as individuals, and make our assessments and recommendations based off of that. And athlete feedback is a huge part of it, and that should go into your acute chronic work ratio, if you will. The term is okay, but if we're just looking at distance in time and RPEs, that doesn't help our quarterbacks, because it doesn't play for our quarterbacks or alignment.
Well said, Mark. Another one here, I'll throw it to the room. Do you see COVID-19 as a catalyst for change? Is there a chance to engage sport coaches in a conversation about readiness? How much does this bring in all the sport coaches into this equation that most of the practitioners on the strength and conditioning side are doing?
I'll start from my perspective. COVID-19, I think, does change a couple things, where we're looking at a lot of teams, say from the travel perspective, it may be where you travel to play the highest ranked team and go to this part of the country or this part of the world. But I think as we start getting back to play, I think we're going to start looking at more local interactions with different clubs. I think maybe even the reemergence of YMCAs and local community centers. We may need to start really small. I don't know if people are going to be, one, have the money to be able to travel around the world, or two, have the ability from the health perspective to just go anywhere they want. So I think it's going to change things where I think there may be a little bit more sport in the community, which I think is not a bad thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think COVID-19 already has changed our everyday lives. I think it's going to change the way we live from here on out. But I think the important thing is to adapt in a positive way to these changing times and situations. And I agree with what Karen said. We're going to have to come up with ways that limit our travel, limit our exposure, optimize our time together.
Agree.
No, I definitely think, our day-to-day operations are going to change. I mean, we were still struggling with, when we had, throughout the season, you have influenza strains coming through and so forth. And I think that got so commonplace, people aren't paying attention. This is, again, this is bringing up that we can't just let our guard down. So, this year it's COVID-19. We don't know what's going to happen in the next few years. It could be something else. It could come back. It's definitely, I think, going to change us, hopefully for the better, but we're not going back to the way we were. Nobody is.
Agreed.
Yeah, and then one more. We've talked about the vertical jump quite a bit today, and this can really go to anyone. But why is the use of a force plate better than just your traditional vertical jump?
Well, because force plate gives you a lot more information. It gives you power, so it gives you your power generation. So first, I should say, I love the vertical jump, period. I do regularly in my training, I do plyometrics. The vertical jump is the best, most reliable, consistent measure of whole body power that there is. So first of all, I love the vertical jump as it is, but with force plates, it gives you a lot more information, especially relative to not only how much power you can generate, but also how much force you land with, how much force you allow the ground to hit you with, and how well you dissipate, absorb force, and regenerate it. So it gives you, not to denigrate just the straight vertical jump or the drop vertical jump at all, great exercises on their own, but the addition of force plates gives you a lot more useful information.
Yeah, I think, from a point of, hey, I don't have the money, or my organization doesn't have the money for force plates, or I don't have the time, do you need force plates? No. you get more information, you can get more detailed, you can probably get more effective. But you can, a vertical jump or a drop vertical jump is going to give you enough information for you to be effective. And, you know, you don't have to be, sometimes people get hung up like, well, if I don't have it, then I can't do anything. No, I mean, vertical jump, you got a piece of chalk, you jump up to the wall and measure it. You know, there's ways to do it, you can get it done. But the more that you dive into the technology, the more you can take advantage of that information.
Agreed.
Great point. Okay, Phil, I'm going to throw it back to you here. Thanks, guys, for listening to me here for a minute.
Well,
Hey,
yeah.
can I say one more thing? I apologize. If you're doing just a straight vertical jump or the drop vertical jump, I would suggest videotaping it, you know, with your phone or whatever, because not only how high that you're jumping, you can measure that, but then you can start looking at where their movement is. Are they, you know, is it their knees aren't bending, or they are bending too much, or the, you know, the hip or whatever. So you can get a little bit more out of it, and everybody's got a phone now with a video on it. So I would also suggest that.
Absolutely agree, and get that frontal plane angle and the side, get the sagittal as well, because they both can give you a lot of good information.
Great. And I think just a key, in case some of the acronyms that were thrown out weren't picked up on, Mark mentioned RPE as a great monitoring tool as well for internal load. You know, having somebody rate their effort 1 through 10 is completely free. You know, in a lot of research been shown to have incredible reliability and validity, especially even compared to heart rate. So, but want to wrap it up here. We're at the top of the hour. Want to thank everyone for joining us. Huge thank you to the panelists. Fantastic wealth of knowledge. Recording of this will be up on academy.spartascience.com. So we'll host it there for you guys and then email it out as well. In addition, our team at Sparta, mostly ex-athletes, ex-coaches. So we love feedback. So any questions or feedback for us, send us a note, success@spartascience.com. So I want to thank you all and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye now.